As we get closer to WWDC, the leaks keep on coming about this year's software updates, and first up is iPadOS. So it seems every year we hear about iPadOS becoming more like macOS, and this year is no different, with Mark Gurman giving us the same promises. Gurman says there'll be 3 main changes with iPadOS 19 to make it more like macOS, and that's improved productivity, improved multitasking, and improved app window management, which is quite a vague list of changes. What does improved productivity even mean? Honestly, at the end of the day, the list of changes people want to see with iPadOS will be so vast that Apple's just better off putting macOS on the iPads. For example, with improved multitasking and app window management, many would just want Apple to ditch Stage Manager and use the window management system macOS has, and so if iPadOS is becoming more like macOS, you might as well throw macOS on this. Another aspect that many would like Apple to change with iPadOS is the Files app, for example. It's not too great, and so to solve this, Apple could add Finder from macOS to the iPads, which is why, again, it's easier to just chuck macOS on this. I know not everyone uses the iPad as a laptop replacement, and so Apple could make this an option where you can dual boot iPadOS and macOS. So yeah, I don't see the point in iPadOS slowly becoming more like macOS. And also, as I said, we do hear such things every year. I feel like ever since we saw the M1 in the iPad Pro, we've been waiting for Apple to do something with all this power, but they've been slow to give us new software features. And so I would keep expectations low, guys. iPadOS already is getting a design overhaul, which I'll delve later into, and so I would not be surprised if functionally it's not very different. But if Apple does want to bless us with a meaningful change, please give us macOS on the iPads. You know what else would be meaningful? Clicking that subscribe button, of course. It's free and will bring you the latest about Apple right to subscription box, so please consider it. It would be appreciated. Join the Saran gang now. Anyway, let's move on to iOS 19, because we have new renders that show us the UI overhaul to expect. So earlier, leaker Jon Prosser showed us the redesigned camera UI, the new lock screen where the notifications are more translucent, and there's a more 3D floating look for the toggles, settings and pop-up with a more glassy aesthetic imitating visionOS, and a redesigned keyboard where it almost creates this illusion of it floating. But I'll be honest, I was expecting a bit more, and thankfully Jon Prosser now shares more renders that show us a more drastic visual redesign. And namely, we see circular icons in these new renders, which have been taken directly from visionOS. Jon Prosser had actually first told us in the builds he saw he couldn't see evidence of rounder icons. However, it seems Apple's hiding this element because in current builds, if you long press on a squircle icon, it becomes rounder after a brief animation. Maybe Apple's hiding the new icons in builds to prevent leaks, but clearly that plan did not work because it has leaked, and so Tim's now very angry. But I do like the look of this. Yes, it's just different shaped icons and doesn't functionally add anything whatsoever, but I'm always down for visual refreshes that are executed well, and this looks clean in my opinion. Apple could of course give consumers a choice, and similar to Android devices, it would be nice if you could switch between squircle and circular icons, but this is Apple we're talking about, and they want design consistency, and so I'm expecting everyone to be forced to use these new icons, whether you like it or not. But personally, I'm not against that because these icons are very cool in my opinion. Another UI change to expect is a pill-shaped tab bar at the bottom of many of Apple's first-party applications. You can see how it looks, and it seems Apple's going to be prioritizing putting a lot of tabs towards the bottom of the device, which is great for reachability, especially for those using the Pro Max, and having to do hand gymnastics right now to reach some areas of the UI. Also, Apple's rounding off everything, so if you long press on an app, the menu that comes up is rounder. There's new sliders for volume and brightness in the control center, and also the settings page now has slimmer toggles. There's also a subtle lighting effect to some elements that help create a glass-like appearance. So for example, the flashlight and camera controls on the lock screen shimmer as you move the iPhone, which sounds pretty cool. So overall, I actually love this. Yes, I'm an Apple sheep who's quite easily impressed by new fancy icons, but iOS has looked the same for a while, and so I'm glad to see a visual overhaul that will make your iPhone feel fresh. And yes, I know some may argue we don't need a redesign to iOS, we need stability. In fact, I have a feeling Apple's giving us this major overhaul to distract us from the fact Apple Intelligent Siri features have been delayed, and honestly it's a good distraction because whilst AI features in iOS may eventually get useful, they certainly aren't a must-have feature right now, whereas design changes to the UI is something you would appreciate every single day. My only concern is bugs. I really hope it's not too buggy, but if Apple's changing so much with iOS 19, you just know those first builds are going to be rough, but hopefully the public builds are stable. However, knowing Apple's software quality as of late, I may be asking too much. Now, by the way, it's not just Prosser claiming there will be a redesign. We have had other leakers chiming in as well. Last year, the Verify actually had first mentioned this, but they said it would come to iOS 18, which is wrong of course. Then Jon Prosser started talking about a possible redesign, and finally Mark Gurman's chiming in and suggesting the same. Having said Apple's goal is to make Apple's various software platforms more consistent in design, and so that means we're going to see these design changes with iPadOS, macOS, and also watchOS. That's good, because it is odd that we got the Big Sur redesign in 2020 for macOS, but those redesigned icons never came to the iPhone or iPads, and so I'm hoping all platforms are based on visionOS, and we have the same general look across all devices. And Gurman also kept emphasizing that Apple plans to change everything. The style of icons, menus, apps, windows, system buttons. The company is also going to simplify the way users navigate and control their devices. The changes go well beyond a new design language and aesthetic tweaks according to Gurman, but unlike Jon Prosser, he did not show us anything specific. I do want to mention that Gurman has doubts over process leaks, but what they both say does line up for the most part. The only aspect we haven't seen yet are the ways functionality of the UI could change. The renders Jon showed are mostly aesthetic changes, but with such a big redesign I'm sure there's going to be a few functionality changes that hopefully don't balk our devices. Let's move on to the devices which will be running iOS 19 and iPadOS 19 this September, and unfortunately there is bad news. So because iOS 19 is going to be such a substantial update, Apple is apparently planning to drop the iPhone XS, XS Max and XR according to a credible anonymous source. These devices were released way back in 2018, so they've already had roughly 6 years of support, so I'm not too surprised by this. The XR especially only has 3 gigs of RAM, so for those still using these devices, just be aware your device may lose support very soon. Now obviously these phones not getting iOS 19 does not suddenly make them unusable. Apple does still release security updates for devices on older iOS versions, and so you could theoretically keep using these phones for a little longer, but eventually apps will stop supporting iOS 18, and you're also going to miss out on your features you'd want to try out. Now moving on to iPadOS 19, Apple plans to only drop the iPad 7th generation, which has the A10 Fusion from 2016. That is a crazy old chipset, but what's funny is that the iPad 8th generation, which has the A12, that Apple's dropping from the iPhone range, is still going to be supported. This has already happened in the past because the iPhone 7, which had the A10, did not get iOS 16, whereas the iPad 7 with the same A10 got iPadOS 16, 17 and 18, so it seems Apple's just happy supporting these iPads for longer because they did launch a couple of years after these iPhones. Does that mean theoretically the iPhone XR and XS could run iOS 19 if the iPad 8 generation is getting iPadOS 19? Maybe, but the iPad 7 generation was very sluggish on iPadOS 18, and so there's a possibility the iPad 8 generation also suffers on iPadOS 19. We will have to wait and see. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you for watching.